So, hello, thanks for joining today's discussion. I am the host for today's proceedings. I won't be talking much when we get through, but I'm Will Jordan, I'm co-founder at IMP Software. And for those of you that don't know us, we provide multi-academy trust budget planning, forecasting and financial reporting software to a growing number of trusts across the country. This is the first of what we hope to become a series of discussions looking at topical points that are happening within the sector, and hopefully I'll be joined with a number of kind of sector experts as we go through. Today is Wednesday, so this is going to be recorded. So this is Wednesday the 29th, which I thought I should say, as guidance is changing all the time, this guidance is as per our experts on the 29th of April. So if you're listening to this next week or the week after, just bear that in mind. So today, with everything that's going on, COVID-19, coronavirus is affecting everybody, and that's a bit of an understatement. But that, in conjunction with the recent very welcome news around the cancellation of the BFRO, what we wanted to really look at is map financial planning in uncertain times. So, a lot of the sector is looking at budgeting or forecasting. So we really wanted to do a really focused 45 minutes to an hour, particularly on that subject. There's not a lot of clarity around at the moment. There is more clarity appearing all the time, but as nobody can tell you what's going to be happening over the coming weeks and months, everybody's in a pretty difficult position. So we're going to try and add some clarity or shed some light onto some of these questions that we've been receiving over the past 2 weeks in the run-up to this event. Whilst we'll pick them all off as we go through, that's it from me. And what I'm going to firstly do is just introduce each of the panelists. So in my top left, Pam Tuckett should be the easiest one to identify. Pam Tuckett is Head of Education and a partner at Bishop Fleming Chartered Accountants, and is also a trustee at West Country Schools Trust. Stephen Mitchell is my bottom left. He is interim CEO at Oak Multi Academy Trust, founder of Keystone Knowledge and ex-COO at Spencer Academies Trust. And last but by no means least, we have Stephen Rallis, who is the CEO of ISBL and also a trustee at the East Midlands Academy Trust. So thank you, expert panelists, for joining us today. What I'd like to do first of all is just ask each of you an introductory question, so allow you to introduce yourselves and kind of how you've been dealing with the response. So Stephen, a lot of Stephen Morales, I should say. That's going to be confusing throughout today. Stephen Morales, thousands of business professionals across the country are looking to you at the moment to provide guidance. How have you found the last few weeks? How have you coped with the demand, and how's ISBL coped with also the lockdown restrictions as well?
So thank you, Will. I think we're all adjusting to our new normal, and so as an organisation supporting essentially a frontline effort, we're not immune. As you've suggested, we are trying to work through the deluge of guidance. And I guess for us, things are coming at us from three fundamental angles. So we've got practitioners who clearly want support and guidance through the pandemic. We've got the department who want us to help shape that guidance. And then we've got senior officials and ministers indeed who are interested in our contribution to the broader national effort. So there, as you can imagine, there are all sorts of subgroups within the public sector ultimately feeding into the Cabinet Office. So we're trying to juggle those three things. I think one of the challenges as an institute that's principally focused on professional development. So we're not a media outlet. We're not a magazine. We're not even a union. We're a professional development organisation, and our job really is to improve practice. So we want school business leaders to be better tomorrow than they were yesterday, and that's our mission. But we've had to slightly tweak and adjust to the current environment, and we have to provide that guidance. So like everybody else, we're trying to deal with guidance that's ever changing, guidance that's coming from various directions. We're trying to synthesize that guidance. We're trying to push the guidance back out again in a way that's digestible for members and their stakeholders. And it's very challenging. It's you know, I have said on a number of occasions over the last 4 weeks that as a chief executive, interestingly working from home, I've probably never been busier. It's relentless. It's Zoom call after Zoom call, Teams call after Teams call, and so it goes on. But you know, it's a privilege to be in the position that I'm in, and you know, I take forward the challenge with the same energy that I hopefully showed as a chief executive in normal times. But like everybody, I think, you know, we're trying our very best. There are so many unknowns, there's so much uncertainty. I'm sure during the course of this discussion we'll be talking about the recovery process, reopening of schools, and what that might look like in the context of financial planning. And today the Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson, is addressing a select committee, and you know, he's being probed on what next. So look, like everybody else, we're working through this very fluid environment, and hopefully we're making a contribution that's significant and supportive.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And Pam, so Pam, you work with hundreds of academies and multi-academy trusts. You've been looking through the guidance as well. How have you been working with your customers, and what challenges has lockdown presented to your organisation?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Really challenging time. So our starting point was actually just to make sure we'd made contact with every single one of our clients, whether it was by email or phone call, and we've had literally no end of queries coming through, which obviously we've been trying to deal with and help our clients. We have a dedicated COVID-19 specifically for academies landing page on our website. So there's been some really good resources that we've written for not just our clients actually, but for the whole of the sector. We've been sharing information that we normally only give to our clients, but we've been sharing it for the whole sector just because we think that's the right thing to do right now. So we've got some good stuff on our website. We've also collated all of the key queries from our clients and also our own key questions on how some of the regulations will be interpreted. And we've had 2 meetings with the ESFA we approached them and said, look, we've got some things we need to flag with you and some of our key concerns. So we've had 2 meetings, which have been really productive. I know other organisations have been lobbying as well, but I'd like to think that we've made a little bit of a difference by putting some of our clients' thoughts forward. Some of those things have been addressed. Obviously, I would say the 2 key concerns that our clients have had are around furlough and the application of the PPN, the policy, procurement policy note. And further guidance has come out. So actually our clients have now got probably most of the information that they need. But that's what it's been about. It's been about interpreting some of the initial regulations where actually they can have all the answers. So that's probably been what's, you know, where we've been helping our clients the most.
Okay, great. And so, Stephen Mitchell, in the midst of all of this, you've decided to start a new role. So you started as a CEO with everything else going on. How has that been, kind of getting up to speed with community, the teams, the trustees, and then kind of leading that organisation through this? Oh, I can't imagine what it must have been, being honest.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Yeah, it's been interesting, I think is probably the word to use on that. So my first day in the role at Oak was Friday the 20th of March, so the day that all the schools were actually sending all the children home and making the plans for how do we support the children moving forward into this interim phase. And yeah, it's been fascinating. We've got a great group of schools. It's a small trust. We've got 5 schools, 1 secondary, 4 primaries, with some great things happening. And what's been really humbling to see is the way that colleagues have come together to make sure that we're supporting our children day in, day out, sending work home, talking to them, getting the feedback, making sure the welfare of children is okay, as well as actually providing for the children that are in the schools now. So all 5 schools remain open. And yeah, getting to know the team has been a real challenge, because normally when you start a new role in the organisation, you spend a lot of time talking and drinking cups of tea and chatting and getting to know people. And it's been very hard to do that over Teams. And yeah, as Stephen said earlier, I spend pretty much all day at the moment talking on video calls, and it's getting to know a team in a new dynamic. But it's been really good fun, and it's been really empowering to see the way that colleagues respond, and not just within the trust, but actually across the system as a whole. And there's a huge sense of partnership and collegiality, which I think will continue past the end of this virus. And when we get back to whatever the new business as normal looks like, hopefully we're going to see a greater sense of partnership working across the sector.
Great, quite great. Great to kind of just get inside what your lives have been like over the last few weeks. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you've all got really kind of complementary perspectives. So yeah, I'm excited to see how lively this discussion might get. So thank you very much for those introductions. What we'll do now is jump into some of the questions. And I guess first off, yeah, and kind of what triggered this, because we had a flurry of inquiries around what we should do, is the cancellation of the BFRO. You know, was that a surprise to you guys? And do you think other returns, probably more specifically the budget forecast return at the end of July, do you think that will follow suit?
Can I take that one first? Yeah, in terms of the cancel, was it a surprise? I think it was probably to be expected that they're going to have to do something with return deadlines. Cancelling the BFRO raises the question of how a government are going to do their year-end accounts, because they obviously account at the end of March and they needed our outturn figures to be part of that. And the academies are just one part of it, not all of it. But it was probably not a surprise that they cancelled it, but I query how they're going to get the information, because I think they probably still need it at some point. Do I think other returns? There was a really good piece of guidance issued, and perhaps we can send this out as part of the links to this webinar, that was decisions taken on various documents that have been cancelled or deferred or decisions delayed. Yeah. And you know, the BFR, that typically a July submission, is on that deferred list at the moment. And I'm sure there will be other returns that get cancelled and other returns that get delayed, or they get concatenated into new returns that we'll see. Hopefully what this process will allow is somebody within central government to take a look and say, what's the value we're deriving from these multiple returns that have been sent in? And is there a better way to get the necessary information in a less time-consuming format?
Yeah, agreed. So kind of following on from that, do you think there's a risk, though, that as a result of the cancel, I mean, we had some of the questions submitted for this, and I know I was on a webinar of Pam's yesterday. Do you think there's a risk that because it's been cancelled, that now some MATs and academies will think, well, actually, we don't need to do a forecast now? And you know, what would be your views on that mindset?
Yeah, can I pick that one up, Will? Because I'm quite passionate about that, and I think there's a real danger that if a form is cancelled, that actually then trusts won't do the work, which of course they absolutely do need to do it now more than ever. You know, now is really important. And for those trusts that haven't yet got their head around the impact of what they're paying on their contracts, what they're paying on their staff, and whether they can claim anything under the exceptional grant that's just been published, if they haven't got their heads around that, they really won't have a clue what their likely outturns going to look like. So they've really got to do that forecasting. You know, now is probably the most important time ever for them to do it. So that's certainly what we're telling all of our clients anyway.
Yeah. Well, could I just come in on that? So I think Eileen Milner, the chief executive of the SFA, sent a Dear Accounting Officer letter setting out her expectation in terms of the ongoing assurance regime, and obviously made reference to some of those relaxations. And I think part of the problem in that letter was that there appears to be some latitude, and you know, if you give that latitude, it becomes down to interpretation, and I worry that some will see it as an opportunity to do the absolute minimum rather than what's necessarily required, and at a time when we need to make sure that we're keeping very focused in terms of controls. And I absolutely agree with Pam in terms of the forecasting. So if you look at the guidance that was issued around the 3 exceptional areas that you can claim funding, the caveat to that is that any in-year reserves, any forecast in-year reserves will be discounted from those 3 elements. But what I'm not sure about is, if I look across the system, is whether people are using their outturn pre-COVID as the proxy for that, or whether they're doing a reprofiling exercise in light of COVID, which they absolutely should be doing. So, and it brings us back to the really important role of that forecasting function. So in the absence of that, how do you work your way through what's coming down the tracks?
Yeah, no, great points. So playing devil's advocate, how can Mats produce a forecast when we can't tell them what's going to happen next week, next month, certainly the next 3 months? What are Mats supposed to be doing as they look forward and trying to put a forecast together when there is still less uncertainty than perhaps there was, but still a great deal of uncertainty around reopening and other areas?
I think that's the importance of forecasting entirely, is that it is trying to scenario analyze what is the potential outcomes you could get, and where you've got more risk and more uncertainty. As Pam said, the importance of doing the forecast is even greater. We need to have a look and see what are the various positions that we could conceivably end up in, and what actions do we need to take as a result of those potential situations. And every single trust is going to be in a different position in terms of what their own forecasts will look like. We've all got different calculations to make and different assumptions to build in, but we have to, and we absolutely have to be able to produce a forecast. And those forecasts, plural, may be a million miles apart in terms of the forecast outturns, but at least then you've got them, and you can start to rationalize what does that mean for you and what do you need to do as a result.
Yeah, I think if I can just add to that, Will, if you don't actually have a plan, i.e. a forecast, then you don't know whether you're working towards it or deviating away from it, and you then can't make any decisions at all. So whilst, yes, we accept it's really hard, actually some of the funding streams for the sector are actually quite certain. So the government have said, they will continue to fund. They won't take funds away just because the schools haven't been fully open. So whilst they might not have said that for all funding streams, the core funding streams, the schools will continue to get those. So there's actually quite a lot of certainty amongst the funding streams. The unknowns are actually the costs. So working through those, the big one is your staff costs. A lot of that is quite certain as well. So you're then looking at the margins. So it may well be that once academies start looking at their forecasting, if they can get their heads around what they've done with their contracts, then they actually can probably have a pretty good stab at it.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of what if scenario planning is something that is fairly common when you look at the 3-year budget plan, looking at scenarios around kind of staff models? But is that something that any of you or any views you've got on applying to the in-year forecast as well? Would you go to the extent of thinking about some what if scenarios in the in-year forecasting, or would you create multiple versions of the in-year forecasting looking at different assumptions?
Well, I think I think budget forecasting, budget planning is iterative anyway by its very nature. It needs to be, and I think it's important to consider a number of different eventualities. Now, whether you actually line them all up when you present them to your stakeholders is another matter, because you could end up with 3 years worth of forecasts and 3 scenarios for 3 years, 9 scenarios basically you're presenting to your stakeholders, which could be a bit clunky. But I think it's right to say, given the intelligence that I've got now, this is where I think we're going to end up. What are the knowns? And as Pam said, there's quite a lot of certainty around core funding. In theory, what your pupil numbers are going to be. What your cohort of teachers is going to look like. Yes, there are some unknowns, but that's just part of sensible contingency planning. And I don't think people should be afraid that they're setting a budget with a 3-year forecast, and that things will change. So in 3 years' time, if you don't actually replicate the 3-year forecast that you're presented, there isn't going to be a consequence. It's reasonable, at the end of a period of time, to look back at your forecast and reprofile. That's what we do. But I completely concur with Pam that to do nothing and to have no reference point and no compass with which to navigate your way through the financial and environmental stormy waters would be disastrous. So I think we do have enough information to have a good go at forecasting, notwithstanding the very fluid environment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. So just the last one on kind of COVID specific forecasting. Yeah, if you were there, or if you're working with some of your clients or your own organisation around forecasting in the current climate, which would be kind of the areas that you would really focus on? I mean, I know this will vary to a certain extent, but looking at this more broadly, which would you say are the high risk areas at the moment, knowing what clarity we have had and what clarity we haven't had?
Yeah, and as has been said, a lot of the funding is fairly well confirmed at the moment, and is a path well trodden. We know those. I'm certainly aware of schools and trusts that have got 6 figures of commercially traded income that has just disappeared from them. And yeah, I think the planning around what can you do in terms of your commercial income or your non-grant income and self-generated funding is an area that does need a lot of focus, because there are all kinds of hypotheses at the moment about when you may be able to start replacing some of that income into your organisation, and that has a knock-on effect. And what happens with the costs associated with those? So where you've got staff that are fully funded in delivering self-generated income, what's an organisation doing in relation to that? And there is a tension at the moment between whether or not those staff should be furloughed or whether they shouldn't be, and the cost base that has on the organisation. Play against the fact ultimately we're tax-funded organisations, and what's our responsibility to be looking after our colleagues in this period?
Yeah, well, if I can just add on to that as well, I think obviously forecasting, really there's the 2 aspects to look at. One is, what is your reserves and your in-year surplus deficit going to look like, but also we mustn't lose sight of cash flow. So from a cash flow perspective, I think how and when you are spending your capital money, whether it's out of your GAG or out of your DFC, or whether it's SCA or the SIF money, that's critical to profile as well, because as we know, actually a lot of work in schools is stopped at the moment. So I think it's really important that the trusts get their head around what their cash flow, what that means to their cash flow. The other thing that I think will be affecting some trusts more than others is the impact of staff sickness. So if they have some form of sickness insurance, then they will be dealing with that in a different way to some of the trusts that don't have the sickness insurance. So I think that could be a big thing as well for some trusts, and they need to be mindful of that. Again, it's a bit of an unknown going forwards because we can't predict, what is going to happen in the next few months.
Yeah. Well, I've just got.
Go on, Stephen. Sorry.
So just a couple of short things to add to that. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Loss of non-grant income, absolutely. Staff absence, I think it's going to be a real concern. The 3 other things that I would add to that are IT infrastructure, because I think we could find ourselves in a kind of hybrid model where there's some remote learning and some face-to-face. I think a delay to capital projects, particularly where there's pupil growth, could be a problem. So how do you accommodate those extra children if you haven't finished your capital projects? And then mental health and wellbeing support, I think it's going to be huge, and how we fund that expert support.
Great, good, really good points there, guys. So just moving away from COVID and moving into more general forecasting, which is still relevant. There's still a big part of the sector at the moment looking at a current in-year forecast. But how often do you think Match should produce a forecast?
I think Stephen, I don't know, he's below me or to the right or the left of me at the moment. He's below me on my screen. Stephen said earlier that forecasting is iterative, and it should be an ongoing conversation with the organisation. We should always be looking to see what's our forecast outturn going to be. And a formal process of reviewing budgets can happen on the basis that the trustees and the executive find helpful, but it should be an ongoing process. We shouldn't be taking a budget that was set and then using that one 9 months down the line as the budget we refer to. It should be a continual process. As we learn more information throughout the year, the forecast changes. And being able to do that on an iterative, ongoing basis is only going to help you get better management.
So that process, where looking at that in year, what have we done year to date, and what we're going to do between now and the end of the year. We still probably don't see that happening on a monthly basis. We see a bit more as we get termly, and then perhaps biannually, especially when we look at BFRO as a thing. Why do you think that more of the sector is perhaps not doing this on a monthly basis? Is that due to culture? Is it due to kind of resource availability in the finance team, or is it technology, or a combination of everything?
Can I have a go answering that one, Will? Because I think it depends which trust you're talking about. So I think the sector varies depending on whether you're looking at a single academy, a smallish multi-academy trust, or a big multi-academy trust. And that's just how I'm going to define them for now. So a single academy, I think they're usually pretty much all over it. They're our clients that we talk to are reforecasting all the time. They're always constantly looking at everything. I think when you go into the realms of a smaller multi-academy trust, I think part of the reason they struggle is they haven't got the money and perhaps the technical in-house expertise to do that as easily, because they're talking about a bigger organisation. It's more complex, it's harder to do, and they just haven't got the team to do it. When you then get into the realms of a bigger multi-academy trust, you then find you've got the technical resources and you've got the ability to do that in-house. So I think you go through a cycle, which is what most of our clients have seen. When you're growing, you go from a cycle of you have it all under control as a single academy, then you perhaps lose a little bit of control, and then you get it back again as you get bigger and have effectively more reserves, that more funding that you can spend to get the right people in place.
Well, just if I can just add to that, so I think there's something. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think there is a challenge for smaller trusts, small SATs, for example, in terms of both the technical acumen to produce this information and the systems. I think that's absolutely right. But I think there's something deeper here. There's the spirit of forecasting. Is it a collaborative exercise that is supposed to help you navigate your way through all of the different environmental factors, the in-trust issues, or is there such a high level of jeopardy when you make commitments through forecasting that people are nervous about it, and particularly in front of the regulators? So I've often had this conversation with officials at the department around 3-year forecasts and looking ahead, information looking ahead, because what everybody says, and particularly what the unions say, is what are you going to use this for? Is it stick to beat schools with, or is it a meaningful exercise which is just trying to get a sense of where we are? I think if you take the jeopardy out of forecasting, I know there needs to be this needs to be balanced, but if you take some of the jeopardy out of forecasting, then I think it's easier to get a commitment to doing it. So people are nervous about saying this is what something's going to look like at the end of the year, never mind the end of 3 years, and it's that nervous, that reticence to kind of make that commitment before all the facts are in front of people. And I think that's why you're hearing this noise around the sector at the moment about, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much that we don't know, and as a consequence we can't possibly plan. Well, yes, you can, but recognising the heavy caveat is that, as we keep saying, it's an iterative process. It's one we need to revisit, and we're providing information based on what we know, and when we know more, we'll adjust. So that would be my take.
Yeah, and I think that political pressure on budgeting is real, and we've seen it particularly in the last 12-18 months, where schools last year, when we submitted our BFRs, a lot of schools, and I see this through SRMA deployments that I do, they've put in pessimistic budgets because there was a political point to be made. Trying to say there isn't enough funding in the system, look at what this is going to do to us down the line. We need to raise the level of grant funding that comes through to schools. And Stephen just alluded to the fear that those budgets are then being used to drive scrutiny onto the schools is a reason that those budgets have been put negatively, is to try and drive the alternative opinion of putting more money back into the organisation. And how realistic are the budget assumptions you're using? We've got to take the toxicity out of it. We've got to do the budgets and the forecasts on the information that we have, and to adjust it. And the principles of good budget management being put into schools, using assumptions that you can stand behind, using forecasts that are based upon the best working knowledge you've got in the school, not just last year, add or take off a couple of %, but actually what do we want to achieve for the children this year? As long as those principles are sound and are used, forecasts can be incredibly useful. But I think that there is a problem in terms of the perception of why we're being asked to do forecasts. And it's becoming a compliance tick box exercise rather than something that's used to drive improving the impact for students.
And that's the point. Yeah, absolutely.
So if if you were going to help or speak to a matter that's perhaps might be in this bracket where forecasting is not an ingrained process and the value, and that for a few reasons, they're saying, right, I want to start moving towards a monthly or a more frequent forecasting cycle. What would be the baby steps or the kind of those initial steps that you could take to start moving towards that?
Well, forecasting, it's not just a finance function, and it is the responsibility of the entire organisation. And the best budgets are the ones that are put together collectively, drawing upon the skills and knowledge of everybody in the organisation, not just saying, well, we'll leave that to the accounts team to do. And there's a commitment. So the first thing to do is get that commitment. Actually, this is a whole school approach. Secondly, it would be to bring it back to the school development plan, the school improvement plan, and what do we want to achieve? So a budget should be aimed at providing the resources and the facilities and the infrastructure that the school needs to be able to deliver what it wants to deliver for its children. If it is just looking backwards, and there's some fantastic work done, there was by PwC a few years ago, so when you look at finance sectors across all sectors across the world, they spend 76% of their time producing historical management information, 24% of their time looking forward. So as a sector, we're spending less than a quarter of our time looking down the road of what's coming at us, and 3/4 of the time just telling our stakeholders what we've done in the past. Now that balance is out of kilter. We need to be able to look forward and say, actually, our forecasts of where do we want to achieve? Where do we want our children to be? And certainly within trusts, particularly ones that go all through the age range. If a parent chooses to send their child to one of our primary schools today, or in this September in reception group, and they choose to stay with us all the way through till they've done their A-levels, we've got a moral responsibility to be thinking about what education are we going to be providing well into the middle of the next decade. And our forecasts have got to start working on that middle term basis, not just the short term focus of what do we need to do for next summer.
Yeah, I think
go on, Stephen.
Sorry, I think at the heart of this is, and you'll all know that we've been banging this drum for some time now, is the concept of joined up leadership, and Stephen's just alluded to it, where pedagogy, governance and business are working seamlessly together, not in silos. And you can add to that an approach to integrated curriculum-led financial planning, where you've got curriculum ambition well articulated, an understanding of the operational and staff costs to deliver that curriculum ambition. And then, what we need is to make sure that curriculum ambition and operational costs don't exceed available resources, and that understanding over time is really important. So I think if, as Stephen said, if you can bring the actors together across that leadership triangle and a shared understanding of where where the drivers are in terms of your forecast, and you've got a better chance of both ensuring a commitment to that journey, but greater transparency in terms of those difficult financial decisions. So I agree that it needs to be a collaborative process.
Yeah, well, can I just add the view from what I would class as the accountant's view, which is, how do you actually do your forecast if you're not used to doing them? Because actually that's quite a difficult task. So first of all, you've really got to make sure you've got the right tool to do it, whatever that tool is. There's no point in preparing a forecast that you then can't flex. So it's got to have the ability to have some assumptions that you can flex. Otherwise, you will have wasted a huge amount of time. And these, for any multi-academy trust in particular, it is a huge task to do a forecast. So you've got to make sure that when you're spending your time to create it, that you're using a tool that actually is going to allow you to flex that really easily going forward. So I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. So one kind of point on those forecasts is we've had a number of questions. We had 2 questions actually on this specific point for this, was around when do you start forecasting in the academic year? Okay, because you do your budget submission in July, that stays, it's the budget approved budget, but really there's probably then a budget iteration over the summer and in September that people might see as their proper budget. But then do you do your reforecast from October? So your 1 month actuals plus 11 months budgets, or November? And the reason people ask that question is around because of the teachers' pay awards. So there's been budget for teachers' pay awards, but that doesn't often get paid until probably November payday. Do you think that it is okay to not forecast in those first 3 months, or should you be doing it from month one, as like any other month?
Yeah, I think I'll go first. So I think my view on that is, yeah, you should be reforecasting right from effectively from month one, because you don't know what's happened in, unless you really look at it closely, you don't know what's happened in that month. Something that might have, you know, steered you off your initial plan, and you need to know that as soon as possible, because otherwise you could get to December and not realize you have a problem, and you know, and that would be an awful position to be in. So I think it's really critical. Also, and you talk about the pay awards and things like that. If you've used assumptions in your original budgets that weren't accurate, you've actually got to look at that and redo those on a regular basis to make sure that you're keeping up with everything. So yeah, for me, proper financial governance, you know, it's from month one, and I think, you know, that is what the sector should be doing.
And that,
can I just add to that very, very quickly? Sorry. I think there is something around systems, and the flexibility that the system allows you in order to get information in quickly and out quickly. And certainly when the process starts, there is a kind of lag. So quite often people find themselves 2 or 3 months down the tracks before they've crunched the numbers, if you like. And so there is a tendency to say, oh, let's just write off those 3 months. Now we've caught up with ourselves, we'll just go from this point forward. But I think if the system allows you to get that information more quickly and in a more agile way, then absolutely you've got more of a chance of getting that information out to stakeholders. So I agree with Pam completely that it should be from day one that you're thinking about this, and there shouldn't be you shouldn't be saying, well, let's just write off that period, because that period, you know, important things can happen. But I think the system's agility to get that information in and out is defining in that process.
yeah.
Yeah, and if I could just add another little bit to that, Will, because you talked about the reason perhaps why some trusts don't forecast, whether it's culture or whether it's systems or whether it's expertise. I think the question that you've asked about, you know, the first 2 or 3 months, that's all about culture, because if you go into the commercial world, particularly the likes of listed companies, they will be reporting within, you know, 10 days of every month end, regardless of whether it's their year end or not. But like Stephen says, they have the system to do it. So I think it is about putting that system in place and about developing the culture and the expectation that that is the norm. And I think that's the bit that's missing in the sector. Yeah,
no, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of linked to this, on that kind of salary variance pieces, I must admit, I was surprised 8 years ago when I arrived in education, I saw this thing called a salary reconciliation, which is a line-by-line ticking of what was budgeted for an individual person and perhaps an individual role, and what's, in many cases, what was paid last week in payroll. So timing-wise, there's a question, but it's not something that I've seen massively outside of education. Is there a reason why this is so widely used, and actually do you have alternative strategy to give you comfort and make sure you're on track with your kind of what's actually happened in the payroll versus what you budgeted and what you forecasted, or is that line by line ticking of the payroll rec something that is just necessary?
Well, if I can, I think there is a I mean, and this might not, this is a bit sort of anecdotal and not necessarily evidence based. I think perhaps it's as much to do with a financial control as and almost an obsession and a concern that if you get salaries wrong in education, it's a disaster, and particularly if you get salaries and pensions wrong in the education system, it's a disaster. So I think schools have been under increasing pressure, or incredible pressure, sorry, as long as I've been in education, to get that absolutely right. Because when it goes wrong, there's hell to play. and it has. I mean, I've witnessed it. I've been in the hot seat, as it were, when these things have gone wrong, and it's not pleasant. And then you have unions crawling all over you, and it's so. I wonder whether it's. I mean, clearly there's a control angle, but I also think there's this this is sacred stuff. You cannot get it wrong, and a culture that's permeated across the system. But I don't know what other colleagues feel about that.
I think you're right, Steve. I also think there's a systems issue here and a legacy issue of systems in terms of the way information used to come out to schools to check it, and particularly in an authority-maintained environment.
Yeah, true.
Transfer of information backwards and forwards, and where sign-offs were required. I think there's a legacy of a culture of this is how we do it that has been, if you want to, being supplanted and replaced by better systems now that allow you to do much better exception checking and checking back to your standing data. And a line by line check on a person every single month when their salary hasn't changed can easily be picked up in an exception report. That's the provision of information that wasn't there historically under the old typical FMS type reports that came out of local authorities. So I think that there's just a legacy cultural thing there where we haven't actually looked at it and said, we've changed our systems, therefore we can change the way we work. And people are comfortable with what they know. And we've always checked payroll this way, therefore we'll keep on doing it this way. And I've seen trusts implement new systems and they want to reproduce the reports they had in the old system because that's what they're familiar with, including the layout of the columns and the layout of the logo. It doesn't be like that. It's what are you trying to achieve, and what's the best way for us to do that moving forward?
Yeah, if I can put in sort of an audit and risk perspective on it, Will, it's an interesting one because I think teachers' pay is probably one of the most complicated pay systems that we do come across as auditors. So that, putting that in context, it can be really complicated. But I think you've always got to think about the risk of something going wrong and the amount of time it takes to check it. So if you put the controls in at the right place, which is at the authorization stage, maybe signing off timesheets if there's additional overtime, things like that, get those controls right. And effectively you do test in total rather than maybe line by line. And as Stephen said, exception reporting, you may well have sufficient controls in place to mean that you don't need to do a line by line check because it's all about monitoring the risk of getting it wrong. And there has been this obsession from local authority days, as Stephen says, that it used to be line by line, but perhaps that isn't necessary and perhaps it's time to revisit.
Yeah, but the pain when you have got a problem trying to sort out your end of year returns and your LGPS or your TPS, it's hard.
So, I think because you see the benefit for variance analysis on what's happened against what you thought you were going to happen. Having that by person is great because it just helps explain the narrative. But you'd say then in terms of it being a control, you would perhaps change the focus from a line by line check every single month to really focusing on the change. So the authorization, the actual change, and you put all of your controls around what's changing rather than everything every month.
And then a check in total, as Pam says.
And check in total.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, well, moving out of kind of forecasting, and it's like we say, I think there's been quite a few comments that actually there isn't a difference between forecasting and budget setting, and perhaps that's where some of the challenges lie. And we certainly see that often there is a thing over here which creates a 3-year budget, and then there's this thing that is used for the in-year forecasting. And I think you've alluded to that might be part of the challenge. But then looking at the 3-year, and I don't want to justify that model by now looking at the 3-year budget separately from looking at the forecasting piece, which I think I'm inadvertently doing. But looking at 3-year budget planning, okay, so in any real absence, so parking BFRO and kind of out-term projections for 1920, looking at September 20 and beyond, would you be setting budgets as normal for September, as some things are confirmed for September, or how would you be approaching that? Probably 2021 budget. We'll look at 21, 22 and beyond as part of this discussion, but primarily first, 2021 budgets. How would you be approaching that?
Well, at the moment we are. That is the approach we're taking. We are very much looking at it as a normal budget and go through that process. No doubt we'll do some scenario planning and focusing on the areas where we feel there might be potential for changes, but predominantly we're working on the basis of it being a normal school year. Yeah, on the basis, the vast majority of our funding is confirmed. We know what it is, therefore we know what the vast majority of our costs are going to be. We'd just be scenario planning around the sides.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest. So, I mean, I'm not, as you know, a frontline practitioner anymore. But my my sense of where things are going would lead me to think. Yes, I agree with Stephen that there's quite a lot of certainty, and certainly I'd be starting to build my budget on that basis. But I think in the coming weeks, and I think relatively shortly, we're going to get a sense of what our new normal looks like in schools, which, as I've said, I think will be a hybrid system. I think there's already conversations taking place beyond the kind of noise in the margin. So the Secretary of State this morning has already answered the question, are we likely to see a phased approach? And the answer was yes. Are we likely to see a staggered school day? And the answer was yes. So the way that we operate schools is going to be slightly different, which means that it might mean that we need more people to police schools. We might need transport to be staggered. Catering might need to happen in two chunks in a way that it doesn't now. And so, I'm not saying these may not be big ticket items on their own, but you build them up, add them together, and suddenly, there's a 10%, 15%, 20% difference in your operating model. And so I think, along with what Stephen said, yes, absolutely plan as though you were moving into a normal 2020, 2021, but have in the back of your mind that as announcements come through, you're going to have to build that into your budget planning as well.
And if and when situations change, which it will do, the thinking you've already done isn't wasted time or energy.
No.
Adding to your knowledge. And I think that's the important part, is there's no, to sit here and not do anything until we know what the plan is would be the best possible situation. Yeah, put the thinking in, because then you've got that knowledge to draw upon as the situation evolves.
So linked to that then, do you think then, because I mean, who knows what's happened with BFR? I think the decision is deferred on whether the BFR is going to be extended, but if it does, would you be suggesting that actually the governance model around approving of budgets and forecasting, which normally stops in July and doesn't get picked up again to October, is something that perhaps should be considered in the current climate?
Yeah, I think the approval process for the BFR and budgets generally is the timing isn't great, because academies haven't got the right data to put in their assumptions accurately at the point at which it was typically submitted. So actually just trying to get the ducks in order, in the right order, so that you can use best assumptions rather than best guesses, as it were, would be much better for the sector, and actually would mean that the BFRs would be far more accurate because they would have better assumptions in them. So that would make a lot more sense, I think. But what we say to clients is, if you've submitted your BFR in the past and actually the assumptions have now changed, if it's significant changes, then you need to be telling the ESFA for a start, and secondly, you need to be effectively tracking two budgets, because you've got to track against the budget you've submitted and what you have now worked out as your real budget. Now you've got all of your information. So it's actually quite hard, for academies in the sector to budget. So having a more reliable budget should actually help the sector.
Yeah. And so kind of on the funding side, so beyond 2021, you've got the funding statements that is all confirmed. Are you guys concerned? The economic fallout from this is going to be, pretty large. Is there a concern for the future of funding in the sector? With national funding, how do you see that happening over the next 3 years? We're pretty much fixed for 2021, but beyond that, what would be your thoughts or concerns?
Yeah, I'm pleased I'm not a politician and having to make these decisions. Yeah, it's a devil's own choice, isn't it? And the economic cost is significant and growing by the minute, and somehow that's got to be funded and paid for. Put that into context of everyone that's worked in schools as being classed as a key worker, and people are putting themselves at greater risk than the population generally by being asked to go into schools to continue the ongoing provision. Yeah, there are many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of families across the country that are realizing just how hard homeschooling is. And yeah, I'm one of those, and bless the teachers is all I can say. There's going to be a real pressure to value the education sector more than perhaps has been valued by society in recent years, and therefore a pressure to fund it more versus the cost pressures the government's got to balance. And yeah, that one's way above my pay grade to rationalise. Am I fearful? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a conversation going on right now around the national funding formula and a move to a hard formula. So that work hasn't stopped. The trajectory is still towards a hard formula sooner rather than later. I still think they're planning to consult. Whether they'll consult as quickly as they had anticipated before COVID hit, I don't know, but I suspect they will move those plans along as swiftly as they can. So I guess that's quite promising in its own way. I think Stephen's absolutely right that the currency of teachers couldn't be higher, and you know, when we come out of this, they will be amongst the heroes and heroines, which is a great thing. This whole crisis, the billions that have been poured into recovery need to be paid for. That's an issue for ministers to work through. You know, where they'll choose to put their focus and their priorities, who knows? It's almost impossible to predict. But clearly, you know, if we ever doubted, and hopefully none of us on this call did, the value of teaching and education, then all of that has disappeared with the very crucial role that schools play. And you know, if you've got kids at home, then you understand perfectly what I'm talking about. And you know, there's increasing evidence of the attainment gap growing. All those important inroads that we made over the years are being lost at pace. So the most vulnerable children in society, the ones that are suffering the most through this whole process. So it's going to be really difficult politically, I think, to start to hammer the education system in the short term. Longer term, I don't know. And you know, there'll be choices to be made. You know, what's the tax system in this country? Will that need to be looked at again? Probably. But you know, it's a bigger, more complicated area than we can probably unpack in the next few minutes.
Yeah. All right. We're getting towards the end of the session, so I'm just ad hoc introducing a quick fire round. We've got a couple of specific questions on the budgeted. So, what would you be budgeting for teacher pay increase in September, and what would your assumption be on whether that's going to be funded by a grant or not? I say quick fire round, it's probably not an easy one to answer.
There was the national guidance issue. So you know, ministers have written their recommendations to the pay review board, and I think that will probably come to pass in some elements. I think, as Stephen said, it's very hard to fight against funding the sector at present. And yeah, just to reiterate, I know Stephen's said this, it's all school staff, their stock has risen because they asked people to go in and do huge amounts of work in putting the logistics of running the schools as they're currently providing for as well, and the resources for children at home. So I think the whole school system stock has risen. It's very hard to fight against that funding in the short term, and I would expect it to be funded, if not all, in certainly large part.
Okay, so you expect to see a repeat of the teachers' pay grant methodology for the increase above a fixed percentage, or
yeah,
how would you be
above a fixed percentage? I would be hoping for it. Me being Mr. Prudent when I'm doing budgets, I'd be budgeting it unfunded, but I would certainly be expecting it to come through.
I think that's right. I think there's less certainty over the increases for non-teaching staff. So you know, I think we're close to a 2.75% settlement. I'm not sure whether that's been accepted by the unions, but I'm pretty sure we're pretty close to getting that over the line. So, and I'm not sure that's going to be funded. That'll be a cost to bear, and that's significant. 2.75 on support staff is not to be sniffed at.
Yeah. On teachers' pension percentage, is there any guidance or any understanding kind of direction of travel on? I think it's 23.68% at the moment. Would you be leaving it as it is, or would you be thinking it might be moving in a particular direction?
So again, in the short term, I think I'd be leaving it at the percentage that it's in, and we're seeing some very scary LGPS percentages, and obviously they vary around the country. Who knows how actuaries are going to value what's happening to stock markets and assets and how that's all come about. But the change from the 16.48% upwards was fairly well trailed. And so I think there'll be a long lead in time before the rate moves anywhere. So I'd be confident in keeping it where it is for our medium-term planning horizon.
And on LGPS rates, is there any guidance you can give, or that's, you're in the hands of the valuations and, in your local level, you should have an idea of what's happening? Or is there a broader discussion around, because we're seeing a number of clients actually moving to a 25% over, and that's, some are moving down to that and some are moving up to that. Is that in particular regions, or is there any movement or consolidation of LGPS as a scheme?
It's from my awareness, it is regional. It varies depending upon how your own local pension fund is managing it. And I've certainly been aware of trusts that are paying down at 18%, and some that are paying upwards of 25%, as you say. It's a really hefty cost, and there's a cost about. I think we will see greater pressure from larger trusts to consolidate their assets into a fund that's got a lower rate. And there's certainly a difference when you look at how different pension funds value their funds and their growth rates, etc. Some do it on the values of gilts, others do it on the values of debts and other debt. And I'm certainly not the expert in how it's done, but those differing mechanisms do yield a very different percentage rate. And I think there'll be pressure around some homogenization of how actuarial funds within LGPS manage their assets.
And I think that's one of the challenges we're seeing, even when you move to a national funding formula, which is supposed to provide equity across the system, there's going to be these inequities. And that's something that the funding policy unit will need to work through, because clearly those variations have a significant impact on your operating model.
There was a consultation on the LGPS, but I think it was quite almost years ago now, Will, and I'm not sure the outcome was ever published or it's ever been taken forward, but I know there are certain local authorities that pool all of their academies effectively as one employer.
Yeah.
And the really good thing about that is at least they all know they're paying the same thing, and there is equity. So the sooner actually the sector can have equity across the whole of England, the better, because at least they'd all be paying the same and it would be fair.
Yeah. Interesting. So the quick fire round was a disaster. I shouldn't have introduced that so randomly. We'll move back to the questions we were doing before. So gag pooling. Gag pooling is a phrase that you hear a lot. It's got lots of different connotations, applications. It's a really broad kind of concept. How are you seeing gag pooling evolve, and are you seeing more and more trusts doing it, and are you seeing then the benefits that trusts are achieving due to perhaps being able to be more deliberate with budget allocations and perhaps more accountability centrally?
So hugely controversial issue across the system, and I think again there are almost some philosophical issues to work through when you look at this. If you're part of a trust, my understanding is that the idea of a trust is it's a family of schools working collaboratively together to improve outcomes for that community of learners, that entire community of learners. So in that context, it seems absolutely reasonable to centralise functions, to pool resources, and to distribute those resources according to need. I don't just mean disadvantaged need. I mean need in terms of where the focus areas are. When you're looking at pupil attainment data, where does there need to be investment? Where can we perhaps reduce funding, and so it's, again, like everything else, it's an iterative process. I think where it falls over is on a couple of counts. One is schools that have become trusts, become members of a trust reluctantly, so they've become part of a trust because they were concerned that if they didn't make the move, someone would make it for them, where they've been forced into a trust, and where they want to maintain the same level of autonomy that they enjoyed at an independent school, outside of a trust. Clearly that's not working. From a leadership point of view, from an executive leadership point of view, the way to overcome that is to set out very early the terms of reference, the relationship you're going to have with your local head teacher, your local governing body, if there is one, and to be absolutely transparent about how funds are pooled and then distributed. What's the mechanism that you're using, and I think to clearly demonstrate that actually you're taking away a lot of the pain of kind of non-pedagogical functions in particular, and you are able to then push to the front line those critical resources to do the instructional piece. But that relationship is across the system is at best it's vulnerable, it's flaky, it differs from school to school, and there's still huge suspicion in many local schools as they look to their executive leaders and their trust boards. But if you can get over that, if you can enter into a spirit of, look, this is a community of learners, we're trying to do right by the whole community. As a head teacher, you're just a custodian of one unit within the trust, but you're part of a broader, bigger family, then I think gag pooling can work. But if you don't get that relationship right up front, it's just, it can be very, very tricky.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges within trusts is that philosophy of a trust being one entity. And if where trusts come from is single schools and particularly local governing bodies, you've got this point of greatest affinity, which is people are closest to the organisation they work in or the building and school they work in. And they may not necessarily feel part of the trust in the same way that the executive do. And whilst we'll all turn around and say every single one of our children is worth equal amounts of our time and care and nurture, it's very difficult when you're a local governor who's historically managed the budget, and that may well have been taken away through a scheme of delegation. It's very difficult as a local governor. You're protecting your local school, and therefore the perception you're giving or funding's been taken away from you is real and is tangible to local school people that are based within the local schools. And as Stephen says, building that relationship between the school and the trust that actually we are all one is really important and crucial to this argument. I can see huge positives in the philosophy of gag pooling, but I can completely understand the reticence towards it as well. And it's the only way we're going to get through to a commonly accepted position is by talking through the hopes and the fears, the positives and the negatives of it, and being transparent with how we're using the funding. What are we providing? And being able to answer the questions when it comes back, because there is limited resources within schools. If we had unlimited resources, it wouldn't be a problem. Right. But we have limited resources, so being able to defend and account for the positions you've taken is an essential part of what we do. And therein lies an awful lot of the problems for trusts, is too often we're accused, perhaps wrongly, of not being open with the information that we have. And if we can get better at sharing how we're doing this and why we're doing it and the impact, that will help us.
Yeah, and if I just add to that, Will, across our client base, very, very few MATs are still currently gag pooling. More have started this year, so 1920, we've got a handful extras. On a very technical point, a lot of MATs seem to think they're gag pooling just by putting all their cash in one bank account, and of course that isn't gag pooling for anybody that's watching this when it's replayed. That is not gag pooling. But something that might have slipped under the radar, but we were talking to our clients about it in our recent seminars, is the fact that the Education Select Committee has actually challenged the whole concept of gag pooling and has challenged the DFE to justify why they think it's appropriate, given that the national funding formula is about to be introduced imminently. and why you then need gag pooling, which effectively overrides that. So that's been an interesting development. The government, to my knowledge, hasn't fully addressed that yet, but that'll be an interesting one to watch this space and see what happens.
Sounds like another webinar discussion is needed, Pam.
It will be. My favourite topic, as you know.
Yeah, no, and it's one that we cover. So yeah, it was a bit of a curveball at the end there, but I know it's something that in most conversations we have, we ask about what gag pooling, how do we do this, how are other trusts doing it? So it would have been remiss not to just have something in there. So that's it for today. Thank you all very much for both sparing the time and being great in terms of the answers and perspectives that you've brought. How can people find you? So if they're listening to this and think, oh yeah, they're great, really want to kind of get to know them and their organisation, is it email, websites, LinkedIn, Twitter? Pam, how would they find you?
All of those. I'm active on LinkedIn, watch it regularly throughout the day, but email me direct. My email's on my direct line and email are both on the Bishop Fleming website. So love to talk to anybody about academies anytime, as you well know, Will.
Yeah, I know. And Stephen Mitchell?
Yeah, likewise on all the various different platforms. I'm on LinkedIn. My Twitter is @I'm Steve Mitchell, which is pretty helpful. Emails, happy to give those out. It's ceo@oaktrust.org for work in relation to Oak, and stephen@keystoneknowledge.com with a PH. I'm on LinkedIn and available.
Great. And Mr. Morales?
Yeah, likewise. So you can find us at the Institute of School Business Leadership. ISBL is our acronym. In terms of Twitter handles, we have a number of Twitter handles, but if you put @ISBL, you'll see them come up. Choose any one of them. There's training, there's news, there's my own Twitter handle. And like colleagues on the call, I make contributions via LinkedIn. And there are a number of podcasts that you may be interested to listen to, or blogs, and a whole plethora of resources. So come and have a look.
Great, thank you. For anybody watching, listening, if you enjoyed the session or you've got any comments or suggestions about future versions of these, you can find, so IMP is on Twitter as @IMP_software. We're on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I've got to look at my handle because I don't remember it. WillJ_IMP. Again, I'm on LinkedIn as well. Email is will@impsoftware.co.uk. Would love to hear anybody's thoughts, comments, or any suggestions for future sessions. That's it for today. Thank you again to the panel for giving up the time and giving some kind of excellent answers to the questions. And yeah, goodbye everybody. Stay safe, and yeah, all the best over the coming weeks and months. That I think all we do know is it's going to be constantly changing and a big challenge. So thanks again for listening, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.